Your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but not from you. And though they are with you, yet they belong not to you. You may give them your love, but not your thoughts, for they have their own thoughts. You may house their bodies, but not their souls, for their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. You may strive to be like them, but seek not to make them like you. For life goes not backward, nor tarries with yesterday. You are the bows from which your children, as living arrows, are sent forth. The archer sees the mark upon the path of the infinite, and he bends you with his might, that his arrows may go swift and far. Let your bending in the archer's hand be for gladness. For even as he loves the arrow that flies, so he loves also the bow that is stable. Hi there, it's Christine. Welcome back to the Rose Woman Pod. Now that was written in the 30s, so forgive the gendering of divine consciousness. But what a beautiful idea that our kids have their own will, karma, intention, dharmic purpose, magic, and that we're here to get them as close as we can to their true expression and not to try to topiary them into something that looks good to us. Today we're talking parenting, a subject near and dear to my heart, and my guest is Lindsay Powers. I was a young mom, started at 18 with my first son, Jarrett, being born just after my 19th birthday. And then we had a couple more kids before I was 22, another at 26. So basically raising the kids formed the shape of my life as a human being, in addition to all the other things that I'd done. I tried so hard to give them the right formula, love and affection and food and education and exposure to things, and to bring them to their joy in a way. But there was so much pressure even at that time to do what was right. And what was right was very confusing because everyone seemed to have an opinion. And I believe in this era of social media and all of the changes that has wrought, the stridency around what is right is even greater than it was when I was raising my crew. And our guest today has made a life of exploring that question. Her name is Lindsay Powers. She's the author of You Can't Fuck Up Your Kids, a judgment-free guide to stress-free parenting. She's a longtime journalist, all the big names, Washington Post, New York Times, New York Magazine, Yahoo, Good Morning America, Cosmo, The Today Show, Fox. She was the founding editor-in-chief of Yahoo Parenting also, and recently ran lifestyle and entertainment at Sirius. So, as the mother of 2 young children and the co-creator of the No Shame Parenting movement, she has a lot to say on this subject. So we're going to enjoy her expertise on how to navigate all of the things that are up for moms and dads today. Lindsay and I are coming to you this morning from opposite ends of America. I'm on an island in off the coast of Seattle in the San Juan Islands, and she's on an island in New York State called, what is that? It's not exactly Manhattan. Is Brooklyn an island?
Brooklyn's an island. It's technically part of Long Island.
Oh, there you go. So from Long Island to Waldron Island, here we are. And we are talking parenting, a subject that has been, formative for both of our lives, I imagine. I had my first kid at 19 and had 4 biological kids, and then 2 stepdaughters, and then influenced heavily a couple more kids. And now we have this amazing grandson, Mason, who Lindsay knows personally because her son, Everett, and Mason go to school together. I am just so fortunate that my daughter happens to know the head of Yahoo Parenting and a widely renowned expert on raising kids and is one of the founders of the No Shame Parenting movement. So we're so lucky to have you on the conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm eager to talk about it. I think it's a really important conversation, how we raise kids, but more importantly, the idea that we can raise our kids a lot of different ways and they can thrive and turn out really well.
Yeah, I think the book just came out in March and it came out in the middle of COVID. And even in the middle of this, there are so many places where women or, fathers or mothers, I guess, are raising an eyebrow and saying, you're raising your child wrong, and as if they had some stake in it that was other than your stake. What do you do as a parent to sort of release the judgment of other people? How do you hold your center?
Right. Um, it's a great question, and it's something I continually work at. I wrote the book, You Can't F Up Your Kids, a judgment-free guide to stress-free parenting, and I would be lying if I said that I wasn't affected when somebody questioned my parenting decisions. And I think it comes down to the idea that we as parents want so badly to raise our kids well, and it's so important to us because it's so personal. And when people judge us, it's hard. But what I like to do is step back from that moment and try to look at the bigger picture. Um, I kind of have a professional and a personal philosophy when it comes to raising kids. And my professional philosophy comes from, as you mentioned, I was the launch editor in chief of Yahoo Parenting. I started the Notion parenting movement alongside with my team, and that reached 170 million people across social media. And so that experience showed that it was really resonant, and in speaking to experts and doctors and families, that people feel judged and that we don't need to only raise our kids one way. And then my personal philosophy came from having a really tumultuous childhood myself, and turning out mostly okay. And not that I want anyone to have a tumultuous childhood. When I say that, I mean I grew up with, an abusive parent who was very mentally ill and a drug addict. And I always joke that I turned out mostly okay. But, now I live in Brooklyn, where parents are so hard on themselves, not unlike so many other cities and towns and areas across the country. And when I hear parents uh, just so hard on themselves because they're not doing infant flashcards, or they didn't buy the fanciest organic wood high chair, or their kids don't only eat organic food. I just I just know that these are things that are not going to be the ultimate determination on how our kids turn out. And through research and through my own personal experience, but more importantly through research, I can say that kids really only need three things to thrive, and that is love, which is if you care about how your kids are going to turn out, you're probably pretty good on the love factor, right? You're self-aware enough, you care enough about your kids. Food, something to eat. This doesn't mean that chicken nuggets can't fall under that category. You can feed your kids a wide range of foods and they'll be fine. And the third thing is somewhere to sleep. It doesn't need to be some mansion somewhere. They just need a nice, warm, cozy place. So love, something to eat, and a warm, cozy place to live and sleep. And I think parents are way too hard on themselves otherwise.
I think that's beautiful that you've broken it down into those things. So let's go into love as an idea. So when I read this beautiful book by a man named Baer called Unconditional Love and Parenting. And when I read it, the guy models this affection for his child that is not disturbable by their behavior. So when you talk about what it means to love a child and how to do that in the simplest way, do you give any guidance on how to love them unconditionally versus love with performative requirements?
Yeah, I do. I talk a lot about how we as parents, our job is not to shape our children into this perfect little object. I wrote this op-ed for the Washington Post about how our idea of success is all wrong. Our kids are not successful if they only achieve X, Y, and Z. Our job as parents is to help our children become the very best version of themselves, to give them the tools to realize who they are. And I don't want it to come off as this unconditional love of our children is that we let them do whatever they want and we never discipline them, because that's not true either. I also talk a lot about the importance of routine with raising our children. And routine doesn't have to mean they go to bed at 8 p.m. on the dot every night, but it means that they know what their expectations are. As a parent and a child, they know what the rules are. I mean, kids, they need guidance and support and stability to a certain extent, because that gives them confidence in who they are and what's next, and safety, and that their parents love them. And I think it's really important to not try to shape our children and to love them for who they are, to set down ground rules and expectations and just help them thrive that way.
I love that line about you're not shaping them into perfect little objects. There are a lot of people who treat their kids as status symbols.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and I think that comes out of the fact, I don't think that parents wake up and they're like, man, I'm going to be kind of a jerk to these other parents. I think it comes out of the fact that our society, it is really hard to raise children. And I won't get on a total social justice warrior bent, but I do think that that it needs to be acknowledged that in America, parents have very little support. We have no access to health care. We guaranteed access. We have no paid family leave. We have just outrageously expensive childcare that can rival college tuition in all 50 states, and mortgages and rents. So parents come into this world, they become parents in a world where it's really, really difficult. So instead of kind of fighting these systemic issues, America's really set up for us as parents to feel like, well, this is our fault that we can't afford childcare. Or this is all my fault that I can't breastfeed because I have to go back to work because I have to pay my rent or my mortgage. And then it becomes like this personal failing of, and this kind of war between parents of different races and socioeconomic backgrounds and regions and any kind of difference that parents have of, I can't do this, so therefore I'm failing. But really, when you take a step back, you're like, well, a lot of people can't do X, Y, and Z. And maybe if we banded together to fight some of these systemic issues, there would be a whole lot less parent judgment in the world.
Oh, you're hitting on so many things in there, like the debate between organic food and non-organic food, and the debate between the all wooden high chair and the plastic thing that off gases is very much a class problem.
Mm-hmm. Very much
it's not
a class
that anybody wants to do something that's less than optimal, but really you I'm so glad you raised that point that sometimes you just make do with what you have, and you have to drop the sense of not being enough. So you're really giving a very positive message when you're saying step back and feed them, love them, house them, and work for the best. But this whole question of everybody thinks it's them applies to almost everything in the world right now. It's not just to parenting. And this question of what exists in the individual, what's our responsibility, and what's the fabric of the society we've created. That's beautiful dialogue.
Thank you. And I think it's really important to keep in mind. In my book, You Can't F Up Your Kids, I go into history a little bit of how these parenting ideals have changed through history, and then also kind of internationally, right? Because if there was one way to raise your kid, then you would have entire countries of children who would be screwed up, quote unquote, screwed up, because people raise their kids so differently all over the place, which also allowed me kind of an interesting body of research as a result. So, for example, I have a chapter on pregnancy, and I talk about all of the so-called pregnancy rules. And one of the things that parents are lectured about is drinking while pregnant. And I would never say, like, get drunk every night, go crazy. But I think, a parent that takes a sip out of a partner's beer or has half a glass of wine after a really stressful day, or has a drink before they even know they're pregnant, it just is totally villainized. And so I was able to kind of look at these studies in Australia and in the UK where parents drink while they're pregnant. And when you break down the science, you see that children who are born of parents who drink 4 to 6 drinks per week while pregnant actually have slightly higher IQs than parents who totally abstain. Now, this again, I'm not saying like go out and get drunk, you're pregnant, yay. I'm saying that there's a lot of nuance in science, and what we take as like this is the end all be all. Sometimes we have to say, well, who are they studying? Who are the people? What are their backgrounds? I think breastfeeding, for example, is another really, really hot button topic, and it's very classist, and it can also be very racist with the way that it falls, with the way that criticism comes out. And when you look at the studies and when you strip out the people who were studied, when you strip out things like education level, socioeconomic level, which is the biggest thing, and just things along those lines, you see that there's like basically the only benefit to breastfeeding is that your kid may have one fewer tummy bug throughout their whole life. Not that I'm anti-breastfeeding, because again, I breastfed my kids a combined like 31 months together, 16 months for my first one and 15 months for my second one. But I do think that it is enough to make us stop and question, like, these things we're being judged over.
Well, I love
Does
that
it work for our
you're
family?
myth busting to a certain extent the things that are judgments. On the breastfeeding one in particular, what I find so interesting is when it was initial, when bottle feeding really became a viable option, when it became commercial, there was this time in history when you felt like you could solve a problem with technology and industry that, and it would not have a systemic impact. And so the very first bottles didn't have flexible nipples. And they also, and the very first formulas didn't have the right combinations of what a child needed. Like the nipple on a breast, when it's sucked in, stimulates a place in the soft palate that stimulates brain growth. Now, 30, 40 years into it, those nipples on the bottle that you get are super flexible, and they're shaped like the infant's mouth, and it's doing a lot of the same stimulation activity. And so it's mimicking more and more this miraculous interconnection between the mother and the baby. I do think that there's also sort of the evolution of the practices and alternates, that a lot of the ideas where people said this is better is based on what might have been better 20 years ago, but things have evolved.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, things really have evolved with technology. And I think breastfeeding is really fascinating because you can go back to biblical times and look at Moses being fed by a wet nurse, and then look at how during the Industrial Revolution it was more popular to breastfeed because women that couldn't breastfeed were those who were going to work. But then during like the Victorian era, it was more popular to have a wet nurse because the upper classes at that point wore fancy outfits. And so breastfeeding was like much too complicated with your fancy outfits in your life of leisure. So it's, and even the phrase that everybody uses now that's like real, it's just all over the place, breast is best. The history of that is like, well, breast is better than what the animals that used to be used before formula was regulated. Babies would be fed like goat milk and all kinds of random milks. And it was like, well, breast is better than those for just given, the unique nutritional needs that newborns have. And, I quote this lactation consultant. And as you know, lactation consultants are obviously very pro breastfeeding because it is their livelihood. But even, she says that if every baby in the world had access to formula, children wouldn't die. And I think that's hugely important, that there are women, predominantly women, of course, who are just beating ourselves up so much because, not being able to breastfeed exclusively for a number of different reasons, ranging from they physically can't to they don't want to any number of reasons, right? You shouldn't have to justify it. But then it becomes like this totally judgy discourse. And so I think, like, if there's anything else that comes away from you can't F up your kids, and any other message I ever want to get
you can't F up your kids. They're resilient.
Yeah, they're resilient.
They're nutritionally resilient. And
there's a million different ways to raise them and for them to be fine.
Okay, so let's talk about the places where you can fuck up your kids. Sorry. Now, so there are some places where children are inheriting things from their parents, like racism and violence and abuse and things like that.
Yes.
So I think here's the question. How do you as a parent know when you really need to go to therapy so you don't pass on these terrible behaviors that happen to you to another generation? Versus just relax because you love them and you're feeding them. And how do you tell the difference?
That is a great question. First of all, I think we need to destigmatize therapy, because I think therapy is a great thing. Like, why not talk to somebody and kind of sort out your issues? Everyone's got some kind of an issue. Doesn't mean we're effed up. Everyone's just got an issue. So in the book, I list 5 things that can, in fact, screw up your kids. And it's about 1 page long or page and a half long. And one of those things is abuse in any form. Like this isn't like, oh, you're overwhelmed and you scream once at your kid because they're like following you for 4 straight hours. This is like sustained abuse. That, of course, like you need to stop and get help. Neglect. Again, this is not like I'm so busy at work, so I gave my kids, a tablet or my phone to play with for 2 hours. No, this is like sustained neglect, like you leave your kid alone for 10 hours a day and like leave the house. That is problematic and can screw up your kids. Not vaccinating your children, again, can screw up your kids. Research is definitive on that. Smoking while pregnant, research is definitive, can have some issues. That said, if you are pregnant and listening to this, if you quit immediately, the great thing is that the benefits are immediate. So it's never too late. So there's like a handful of things that are bad. I think racism is huge. Like this is something we as parents, it's our responsibility to talk to our kids about tolerance and acceptance. And we're never too young. We're never too young to spread the message of kindness and tolerance and acceptance and friendship. So I think, there are some serious things that parents should do, and there are a lot of things that parents don't need to worry about. And if you are questioning, like, hey, is this problematic? Then what do you lose by talking to someone? I know therapy can be really expensive for some people. It's certainly an barrier to entry rather. And in that case, I recommend, an app like BetterHelp or Talkspace, which has a flat fee, speaking to a clergy member, a trusted friend, someone that you can just, a partner if you have one, just getting a second opinion and talking through some of your concerns.
Yeah.
Because I think
Someone
that
told
can be
me once
helpful.
that if you're a father to be, that your number one job is to resolve all of your own daddy issues before the baby's born, which I loved. I thought that was a great advice. Yeah, so that you step into it in the pure peace and power of you. Anyway,
I love that.
I think in this question, I want to go back to what you were saying about the culture that supports parents and really supports bringing in a generation that can love and work and find their passion and be happy and be healthy and be whole. Like if we want that as a culture, what would you like to see happen in the fabric between us to ensure that?
I would like our culture to accept that caregiving is a legitimate job, whether that's
Amen.
a teacher, a daycare provider, a parent. I think that throughout all of human history, it has been written off as women's work, and therefore it's been given short shrift. So I think that is something we as a society need to ask ourselves. I wrote this op-ed for Yahoo saying that all parents who are teaching this fall should be paid. Pay us. Like, you want us to do it? Pay us. And I got so many hateful emails and comments about why did I become a parent if I wanted to be paid? And I just thought, you know what? Like, here we are in the middle of a global pandemic. I'm balancing my full-time job, promoting my book. My husband also works, my children. The fabric of our society was essentially ripped apart very quickly. Our daycare providers closed, our schools closed, everything. It's like, yeah, I became a parent, but like not to do 3 full-time jobs at once, plus the kids. And, so I think that we need to value caregiving.
Yeah. What are you learning in the pandemic period from other parents about, I want to say caregiving, but also about this idea of being your child's first teacher with this homeschooling? I saw a funny meme that was going around where she's figured out how to handle her child during her conference calls and he's taped to the floor with duct tape.
Oh, God.
Not recommended. It was a joke to point out, the difficulty of trying to do both. I was listening to my colleague had a Zoom call yesterday, and a woman's baby woke up from their nap, and while she was in the middle of her presentation and started crying, and everybody on the phone was very receptive and supportive. But the idea that your employees, your colleagues all have families, all have home lives, like they've never really been in your face before. And now in this new model, you're really seeing what everyone's juggling. Do you think that the culture will learn just what it's like to have all of these responsibilities and change as a result?
I hope so. I think there are some benefits. Right. I was on a conference call this morning and my 4-year-old came marching up and he was really proud that he'd like made this toy. So I just like picked him up on my lap so he could like show it to the Zoom call. So I think that's a benefit. But I do think that, people who are affluent enough to be able to like have jobs to work from
Mm,
home, I think
mm,
they'll see the bulk of the cultural shift. I mean, I think
mm,
there's just a lot of people right now who have been forced out of the workplace, especially women. I just covered a report from the UN yesterday that said women could see an erase of a generation's worth of gains because
mm,
women are more likely to be employed in fields that have been more seriously impacted by coronavirus, whether that's service fields, such as working in a restaurant or a hotel or a store, um, or just by like not being able to have childcare. There's also, a whole swath of our population that's back in work in person. I mean, our amazing first responders, grocery store workers, frontline workers, and they're in a particularly hard place because what do you do with your kids then? And I think that's something that's really huge. I think this pandemic has taken all of these issues that parents have faced for a long time that we've all kind of like quietly struggled with on the background, right? Of
mhm.
stitching together childcare and throwing so much money into it. And, one parent, usually the woman, steps out of the workforce and loses, her career track and all of these things. But the pandemic's like blown them into like the forefront of our conversation, into visibility. And I hope that it sparks a lot of conversations because I think that these conversations are really important because words are important. They they can spark change.
So we're designing a new culture from the
I hope
ground
so.
up. And in this new culture, of which Lindsay is in charge of designing the parenting part. Okay, so you're designing this new world, and at what scale do you organize? Do you organize it at the community scale, at the
Mhm.
city scale, at the state scale, at the federal scale? Like, where do you see the most design potential? Is
Yeah.
it through companies and corporations? I mean, I wouldn't rely on that personally, but possibly. So,
Right.
what's the organizing framework for making a culture that works for everyone?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm not a policymaker, so I'm sure, I will fumble this question somehow, the answer to this question somehow. But
There are no
first of
wrong answers. No shame interviewing. No,
all,
sorry.
I love that. I do not think it should be at a company level. I think it would be really unfortunate that like a parent would be stuck at a certain role or job because their childcare is connected to it. I think we've
Mm,
seen major issues with that and healthcare right now. Um,
mm,
I do think that there should be choice for parents. To me, like modern day feminism and supporting parents is to give choice because some parents want to work, to stay home, work from home with their children. Some parents want to have a career. Some parents want a little bit of both. So I think that I would create, from a federal perspective, I would pay childcare providers more. Teachers should be earning more money. Childcare providers, daycare workers, nurseries, nannies should be making more money that should be subsidized by the government. It should be from a young age. And I think that paid family leave should be mandated for men and women. I think as long as, first of all, there's no paid family leave, it's only like 6% of Americans have access to it, which is just insane. But as long as as only women take paid family leave, it's always going to be written off as just like this women's thing. So I think if companies, we've seen success is countries that will give parents like 60 weeks of paternity and maternity leave, but they mandate that men and women need to split it. So I think we just need to, at a really young age, shift the culture, and to provide funding on a federal government level so that it's not like New York is a more progressive state, so we have better child care policies, whereas Texas is a red state, so they have worse child care policies. Like that's just not fair. So I think at a federal level, we fund healthcare, paid family leave, mandated for men and women, and then subsidize childcare.
I like that you're addressing the policy question because it goes back to this idea of what's the space between us and how to take the pressure off mom who's on her way to school with a runny nosed kid and has an appointment for her work. And, dad is home trying to look dignified on a Zoom call and front for his colleagues, while they're trying to get all this stuff done, they're not alone. And that dialogue's important.
Well, and I think that the policies that I'd mentioned sound really radical right now because it's so different than what we live. But now you go back to the 30s when Social Security and Medicare became a thing. People thought that was outrageous at the time, and now imagine saying, well, we're going to take Social Security or Medicare away. I mean, it's after you kind of can enact these policies, then they become part of the fabric of the culture and people see the benefits of them. So I don't think that progress is linear, but I do think that we can do it. And I hope we do.
Okay, let's go back to the personal. Thank you for that. Let's go back to the personal. So what are the most common things that you find? Like I think food, for example, or screen time is another where there's a lot of judgment. What are you hearing? What are the top hot buttons that parents are rolling their eyes at each other about?
So right now in COVID era, it's school. School is by far the most judgy discourse that I've seen. If you're going to go back in person, if you're going to do virtual schooling, if your school's going to have a mask mandate, or if you're going to podding is so judgy, and the idea of podding is that you partner together with maybe like another family or two families or three families and you hire your own teacher. So the only families that can really afford to pod are families that have the resources and the money to be like, now we will hire a teacher for our 3 children. So people are just like so mean. I'm in this local parenting group in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, and the owner of it's all over email, and the owner of it had to, once the school date start was pushed back, had to get on email and say, everybody stop. I paused emails. Everybody needs to reread the emails that they're sending with a critical eye and then decide if you want to send them out, because people were screaming at each other so much. So that's kind of like our new COVID one. But then there's plenty of other topics that are like perennial judgment things, as you mentioned, like screen time, food, discipline.
Where do you stand on those?
I am. Well, the one thing I should say is I'm not opposed to changing my mind. And I argue it in my book, right? Your life changes, your situation changes. Before, I've always been like relatively lax on screen time. I don't let my kids watch like 10 hours a day of it. And in fact, right in the beginning of COVID, when we were all kind of freaking out, I did at one point just hand my kids a tablet. And I think, they watched it for the first day for 5 hours or some outrageous amount. And they were just like lunatics after. So I was like, well, just by necessity, not like my own, upstanding like screen time beliefs. Like my kids cannot watch screen time all day unless I want little maniacs. But I've always been relatively relaxed on screen time because I do see there are benefits, and I cite some of the benefits in my book that research has shown. They help. Screens can help connect people, which is more important than ever right now when so many of us are disconnected from our villages and our communities as we quarantine and limited our interactions during COVID. Even though we're all pretty sick of Zoom, but there are benefits. That can also be learning. A lot of this, when kind of this anti-screen time discourse first started, it was like when you would just sit and like stare at a screen. Like I grew up spending summers with my grandparents watching The Price is Right. I'm like, I turned out fine, whatever. But my kids now watch more interactive apps and games and shows that do cause them to think a little bit. So I'm pretty chill on screen time. I think right now we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and there is literally no way we're going to look back in 10 years and be like, man, I really wish that my kids watched a little bit less Paw Patrol during that nationwide global pandemic situation. So yeah, I think we need to be a little kinder, to ourselves on that.
You make it sound so easy. Just be kinder. They watch a little more. Who cares? Take the big picture. It's an 18 to 25 year legacy, people.
I find that by taking the big picture, it's a lot easier to be a parent, because I don't think that my children are going to be screwed up for the end of time because they watched a little bit of TV. I think I love them. I think they have plenty of food. They're so lucky to have, a bed, their own bed to sleep in every night. And so I'm just like, they're going to be fine. And I really carry that general belief, that the optimism that our kids are going to be fine above all else, in my head.
I love that. So you mentioned before experts and consulting experts, and all I could think about was the decades of Dr. Spock.
Yeah.
Where it became the Bible, and or like in the Victorian era where you weren't supposed to show any physical affection and treat them like little soldiers, and sort of how these things go through phases of being in fashion. And you said something early in the conversation on becoming self-referential and tuning into what you know and what your children need. And I wonder if you could just speak to the balance between expertise and intuition.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that you need to be careful who you decide is an expert. A doctor is an expert. Your pediatrician, though, is more relevant and a better expert in your life than some doctor who wrote a book that's not relevant to your life, because your pediatrician knows you. You talk with him or her. They have helped you raise your children. Medical advice has to work within the context of your life. When you look at who is named an expert in our society, you see there's so many interesting ulterior motives that these experts have, whether it's religion. There's this really popular parenting book called like Becoming Baby Wise, and people love it. But that's actually the commercial name of it. The first name of it was something like Raising Your Child in Jesus's Eyes to like love God, or like just something that was like super religious. And I'm not anti-religion. I think anything you can build, anything in your life that brings purpose and community is amazing. But the fact of the matter is, like, there's kind of a lot of like religious and patriarchal and classist and sexist undertones to a lot of this expert advice. So that's when I say intuition is really important. You may have 10 people tell you that you need to feed your kid X, Y, and Z, but if that ingredient doesn't grow where you live, like, how can you do that? That's out of your control. So you have to say, well, like, intuitively, it makes sense for me to raise my kid this way. And you can be steadfast in that decision. And then when you learn more, you can change, right? When we know better, we do better, as Maya Angelou once said. So I think it's really important to trust ourselves and to have experts that we can trust, like our pediatrician or a local doctor, and use that to inform our intuition.
Great. That's great. I think I've also been so lucky over the years to get little tiny pieces of advice that have stuck with me. And this gets to the next question on when you need to like perk up and pay attention that there is something going on with your kid. I remember when Kyle, my third child, was little, he would come in the door from school and he, like third grade-ish, and collapse at the front door, crying and mad and all kind. And I'm like, what is going on with him? And an older woman told me, oh, if he's getting reports of being ill-behaved from school, but he's perfect at home, that's when you have to worry. But if he's fine at school and he comes home and collapses, it's because he's safe there. And I was like, oh, that's such a sweet answer. I love that. And it turns out that he was really stressed at school, and this is the place that he could kind of let down his guard. But, even that was a pointer to going in and investigating sort of why he was stressed out at school and what happened with this new teacher and blah, blah, blah. But so talk a little bit about what are the red flags for when to perk up and pay attention that there might be something going on with your kid.
But I think the biggest thing is that your kid. When Kyle was showing you these behaviors, you were like, hey, that's like, that kind of like sparked your interest. You were like, this is unusual. Let me look into it. And so I think that's really key. If there is something that's nagging you, like, my kid's behavior changed really quickly, or, like they just seem different, then I don't think that's a bad thing to investigate a little bit with an open mind, right? Like you spoke to his teacher and learned from there, and then you're able to kind of make an informed decision. I think for us, red flag wise, it's really being in touch with our intuition. And I know that it's so much easier when I can say like, oh, well, when your kid does this specific thing, that's bad. No, I mean, I think you know your kid, their behavior changes. You listen to your intuition. If something's nagging you, it doesn't hurt to put a phone call into your pediatrician, um, and to trust yourself to know when something seems a little off. There's no way that we can like guess every single thing with our child, but I think also just maintaining a relationship with them and open dialogue. It goes back to kind of establishing this unconditional love with our kids. We give them the space to come to
Mm,
us when something feels different and wrong,
mm,
and we tune in when they do. Take advantage of that.
mm. I love that. So when you're sitting there and it gets to be too much for you,
Mhm.
do you have other moms and dads that you guys can lean into, like parenting co-op, or how do you find the space for self-care in the middle of all the things you're doing with little children?
Oh, well, this is the big problem with the pandemic right now is I had my village ripped out from underneath me, which it really sucks. There's like no way to sugarcoat it. You know, I could go next door to your daughter's house and say, "Hey, can you take my kids for a minute?" Or I could take your grandson for a minute and go to the park. You know, I have this great group of friends that nearby me in Brooklyn, and we all really supported each other. We would get together and talk, and you know, and I'd go to Pilates once a week and read a lot of books, and I just had a much richer community before this happened. And not to mention that I paid for amazing childcare before this happened, um, whether through my taxes for the local elementary school or for the daycare that my younger son went to. That was incredible. And all of that poof is gone. So self care is really hard right now. And I find myself getting really stressed about it. So I try to find like little mini pockets. I'm lucky enough where, you know, to have a good partner who will step in. So my husband will, I can kind of say like, I'm overwhelmed. Like I need to go sit and drink a glass of wine 6 feet away from one of my girlfriends tonight. And he'll be like, great, I'll do bedtime. Vice versa. Or I'll like, you know, once I just got like super stressed and was like, I'm done. And just like went upstairs to our bedroom and closed the door for 20 minutes and didn't look at my phone, just kind of stared off into the wall. And that's when I had this realization that during pandemic times, my goal is to be the quote unquote world's okayest mom, not like the most amazing mom. There's no such thing, and we can't be perfect anyway.
I saw that. I
Trying.
saw that. The world's okayest mom. I love that so much. I'm like, yeah, that's probably the world's best mom. Because if you're that chill, if you're that chill that you're chill with being okay, you're probably the best.
I hope,
But this,
you know,
but I just
yeah.
want to like, that's really nice that you have your spouse to balance it off. That's beautiful. I can't imagine being a single mom in these times. That would be also much more difficult. But also, what a toll on your marriage. You know, not necessarily
yeah.
yours, but on the intimacy and the sexy romantic part about being like turned on by your partner, and like where's the space for that if you're always trading off duty?
It's
So
exhausting, right?
I'm going to send you some products, and I don't know what we're going to do to get you a babysitter for the evening. But
Oh, you're so funny. I have a whole chapter in my book about sex, and we talk a lot. I talk a lot about the importance of scheduling it, and I don't know because I feel like your products are so. I don't know. Maybe are you against the idea of scheduling sex?
no way. For me, first of all, the products are about you for you, like that you take care of yourself. You know what you desire. You touch yourself. You take care of your skin. And then a side benefit of feeling great in your own body and feeling comfortable is that you might be more aroused or turned on or available to someone else. So a lot of it is reclaiming sovereignty over your own body. But, you know, saying to be conscious of like having date night and creating magic and making play and scheduling sex is like, that's exciting. That can be great. It's like creating a sacred time for yourselves. I have no problem with scheduling. It's nice when it's spontaneous, but when you're running 3 businesses, and even if you don't have little kids at home, it can be hard to find the time. But I find like if I have a spot that's like set aside for that, and then I can pre-plan, like creating a little delight. Like sometimes we'll not only have a date night or a sex date, we'll have a like who's in charge of that one. And then you just like lay back and wait to be delighted by whatever they've got in store. And that's so fun too, because it takes all the pressure off. And then of course, if the day comes and it's just been like, you're blown out or whatever, then you fall back into that loving tolerance of what is. But in general, I like it.
Yeah. I think that the whole like loving tolerance in whatever context is kind of like the name of the game right now. Like we're all meeting each other at different places, mentally, physically. And I think it's hard.
I will say that on the pod thing, you talked about like the podding. I'll tell you a little narrative from where we live in Venice. The houses that are on either side of us. Venice is a little bit like Brooklyn, but people are also very busy with their careers. And when people ended up having to stay home, the 4 houses in a row on our street got together and said, if you guys all follow protocol for the next 14 days, then we can all share our gifts. And like one's a vegan chef and one's a yoga teacher. And they got some weightlifting equipment from a gym that was going under and put it in the backyard and basically created like a micro clean zone among the neighborhood. And one of the side benefits was really getting to know their neighbors and our neighbors in a new way. For all we would have paid for all those things before. And and so they did create a micro safe zone that I don't think is necessarily class oriented or economic oriented, but a willingness to cooperate.
Yes, I agree. I think that is beautiful that was able to happen. And I also have a good friend and then one of their friends, and they have kind of figured out a way to make it work with schooling and together, and it's not a classes thing. And, so I do think there are ways to make it work, but how it's kind of being marketed now, I think like with anything, right? It's hard to make sweeping statements of something, but a lot of the potting situations now have to do with having the resources to be able to hire an educator, which can be tough because not everybody does.
And we'll get through this time, even while we're in it, talking to our kids about how this is an unusual time and something has happened and there was a time before this and there will be a time after this, so that they understand that what's happening is unusual. Already they're getting, kids are having some side effects from having to stay home. We're not getting as physical activity or as much socialization, and particularly adolescents, right? In the time when they're supposed to be differentiating from their parents and getting out and spending time with their friends and becoming what's the core jobs of adolescents, becoming and belonging and becoming themselves. Like they're stuck at home with their parents. Oh my God. So even helping them to frame that this is an unusual time is a quality of this intimacy and transparency that you can have with your kids. It's not just take it and try to fix it, but enroll them in understanding what's happening, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's like keeping in the perspective of this won't be forever. And maybe it is an opportunity to rebuild certain things. I think with COVID, it is soul crushing on one level to be stuck inside your house and have your social life disrupted and all these awful things. It's devastating, the deaths and sicknesses that, and so much trauma that people have experienced. But I think it's also given people more like some people more compassion to care for our neighbors and to speak out on racial injustice and these really kind of important things that we need to be doing in our society. So I think there are good things, there are bad things, like with all things in life. But I do agree that we're going to find a new normal. This isn't forever. And it's hard to keep that perspective. I get down, especially with school and juggling school and work. But it's like having guardrails with yourself. When do I need to talk to somebody? When do I need to get help? When do I need a break? And really honoring those boundaries.
And when can I just throw pillows and say, have some fun and be like, letting everything else go today.
Yeah, I know. I understand. But I really feel for the kids.
And I feel for the young moms. So that shows where my empathy is gone. Like, oh my God, that must be so hard. No, there is a lot of magic. So I love your message. You can't fuck up your kids. I love the message of no shame. I love the message of no judgment, all the stuff that you're talking about. And you have a really active online community and places that you're doing interviews.
So if you go to at No Shame Parenting on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter technically, but I'm not as much on that. So at No Shame Parenting on Instagram mostly, a little bit on Facebook. You will see my stories of my imperfect life and stories of people near and far.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for the work you do, for easing the experience of bringing new beings into the world for fathers and mothers. And because every time you're doing that, you're planting a seed of more compassion that gets into the children, and everybody they touch are infected by it. So this loving compassion that's inherent in don't fuck up your kids or you can't fuck up your kids is beautiful.
Thank you.
So we'll attach the links to this for everybody who's listening so they can find all that stuff. And if you have any questions or feedback, please reach out to Lindsay directly. She's made her life in this, and we're lucky to have her expertise and her brilliant mind asking these kinds of questions. All right, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you so much.
So you may know that in 2018, I wrote a book called Bending the Bow, and it profiled the inner lives of great activists. And I went back and chose the great progressive movements of the last couple hundred years: women's rights, children's rights, sexuality and gender rights, native rights, all of those kinds of things, and looked at people who were really doing the good work 20 or 30 years before a movement became fashionable or mainstream. In that book, there's a chapter called I Am More Than My Age, and it's a profile of Florence Kelly and the children's rights movement. I'm going to share with you the intro to that section now as a bit of a codicil to this chapter on parenting, and more of a philosophical statement on children as a continuation of life itself, that they're not standalone little beings. They are a continuation of the evolutionary story of all of mankind. And they have rights. In fact, they have more rights than us, because we are inviting them into the world and creating the space for them to thrive. And what is our responsibility, truly, besides loving and feeding them, to leaving them a good legacy? So here you have it. I Am More Than My Age from Bending the Bow. I remember sitting in my bedroom in the heat of a July summer afternoon, with the gauze curtains barely moving in the breeze, gazing at my newborn son, the pure potential within him, the joy of life arising where there had been none before, wondering who he would become. I had many dreams for him, that he would love and be loved, that he would inhabit the fullness of his gifts and talents, that he would find meaning and happiness. At no point in welcoming this child into the world did I imagine a life where he would be enslaved or forced to labor at menial tasks for the majority of his life. I had a limited conception, while I was beginning the research on the children's rights movement, of just how bad things were for kids only a century ago. Even today, many people don't think of children as humans in full, but as manipulable creatures, free labor, or chattel. Some do give lip service to the idea that children have rights, but go on to minimize certain groups of children, like poor children, or minority children, or foreign children, because of their origin in an already unprotected class. These children are then trafficked for work and sex, uneducated, physically abused. This is the ultimate example to me of greed and self-abnegation, a denial of the genetic and social pyramid that suggests ongoing improvements for each generation on Earth, that they're climbing higher than we are. Yet that is what we do collectively, pass on our traumas, in addition sometimes to our hope and our invitation to greatness. As recently as the 1780s, a child in European society was the property of his or her parents, a tertiary kind of person and not a very valuable one at that. Judith Inuit, Cultural Survival, says, according to Blackstone's 1758 legal commentaries in England, for instance, child abduction was not theft in the legal sense unless the child happened to be dressed. The thief was regarded as having stolen the clothes. Apart from that, child theft was tantamount to stealing a corpse. In the case of both a dead body and a live child, no legal person was involved. In the West, we have seen a relatively minor sense of children being part of the collective emerge. We educate them publicly, if unequally, and attempt to offer care for the hungriest and most abused. Yet for the most part, children today have little voice in their own care and representation. In this blind spot of under 18, a child's reality is barely visible to the outsider. And even if a child's environment is visibly unpleasant, unless the situation involves criminal negligence, and often not even then, neither the state nor neighbors intervene. And in this twilight space, parents inflict every manner of emotional and psychological damage and transgenerational entrainment on their children, often passing on the patterns of what was done to them. Whether unconsciously or willingly, citing custom, values, discipline, or control, adults frequently usurp a child's bodily sovereignty through corporal punishment, physical restraint, forced feeding, denied feeding, even genital mutilation for both boys, circumcision, and girls, clitorectomies. And in extreme cases, this physical domination leads to sexual abuse or other forms of abuse. Adults murder, maim, and traumatize children in warfare, whether the war is at a nation-state level or class, race, or gender war level, like the war on Black boys in America. And more subtly, some adults speak to their children in ways that diminish and shame them, behavior that has been shown to cauterize the developing brain's linguistic processing centers. The Jehovah's Witnesses don't allow kids to sing. The Baptists don't allow dancing, and there are indirect violations as well. Adults as a whole are burdening younger generations with crushing debts, from environmental degradation to massive government financial obligations to species extinction. The list goes on. Today, I contend, we are just at the outset of the children's rights movement, a movement that began in the late 1800s, saw its first victory with the child labor laws of the 1920s, and continues to strengthen. The children's rights movement, like the other movements we look at, has been gradually awakening to the power, wonder, beauty, awe of all life, and represents a worldview that moves us more toward justice and peace for all. As a mother, and as a person who believes in self-determination, as a citizen of Earth, I imagine a world where children are treated as the ultimate fruits of our own lives. They represent evolution of life on this planet and deserve to be treated as humans in full, with well-defined rights and fully endowed futures. Thank you so much for joining me on the Rose Woman Pod. I'm Christine Marie Mason, your host. The pod is brought to you by Rosebud Woman, a company I started in the intimate skincare space. You can find our amazing products at rosewoman.com. Vegan, plant-based, pure, effective, all the good stuff. The guests and I imagine people out there when we do these shows and think, how can we bring one little bit of insight, one little lever to create more spaciousness or happiness out to the world? So if you like the pod, you know what to do. Please share it, rate it, review it, subscribe, all of that stuff, so that we can feel your love and support and keep doing it. Have a wonderful day, no matter where you're at. May the grace and joy that rests at the center of you be readily apparent.